Hello everyone, and thanks for choosing to join me today. I really do appreciate it. If I sound rather chipper, it's because, well, you'll find out soon enough. Look, it's fairly obvious that the internet loves drama, and if you're into that sort of thing, then this video essay will be right up your street. It's got everything. Will forgery, fraud, thievery on a massive scale, 3 deaths, well, not murder, but there is extortion, betrayal, threats, and even the destruction of my livelihood by someone who I once considered to be my friend. So, find yourself a comfy seat, grab yourself a drink and some popcorn, and buckle yourself in, because for the next hour and a bit, this is going to be quite the roller coaster ride. If you look at the scope of my output here on YouTube over the last year and a half, you'll notice that gradually my uploads have become more and more infrequent, to the point that before this video, the last project that I published here was just a tad over 6 months ago. So why is this, you may ask? Well, it's quite simple really. I've lost my passion and my drive as a direct result of doing someone that I don't even know a favour. This favour was the restoration of 2 ancient prop moulds that I did at my own expense, I might add. I covered the cost of the materials and I donated my skills and my time for free because I thought that the objects in question were worth saving due to their cultural significance rather than having them thrown away as was originally planned. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, during the course of me doing this favour, I and my friend Dan O'Keefe uncovered a massive fraud that not only involved the forgery of a will, but also the removal and dissemination of a deceased individual's entire estate for personal and financial gain by, as it turned out, the very chap that I was helping. Of course, we went to the authorities, and as a consequence of doing this, 2 things happened. First, mine and Dan's name, reputation and standing were dragged through the proverbial mud online, where we were accused of theft and profiteering. Then, just to throw a healthy dose of salt into that wound, a very close friend of mine, who was in some way involved with will fraud, or at the very least benefited from these dubious shenanigans, decided to casually toss aside our 20-year friendship by delivering a petty act of revenge on me. So, what did he do then, apart from spreading lies, rumours, and all sorts of guff around the internet? Did he send me some dog poo through the post, sign me up to some dodgy website, or pour diesel onto my lawn? No, he decided to take things a little bit further than that, as he really wanted to hurt me, and the best way that he could achieve that was to hit me financially. He took it upon himself to destroy my business and my ability to earn a living by registering PB Props and Models as a limited company in his name. He also took the website domains of pbpropsandmodels.co.uk and pbpropsandmodels.com. To complete the trifecta, he even registered PB Props and Models as his own trademark. All this was done obviously in bad faith and with malicious intent to cause as much damage to me personally as he possibly could, to prevent me from using my own brand, despite the fact that I created and developed and have used it since 2003, as well as the variations of the name. Effectively, he's now taken control and stolen PB Props and Models and taken it away from me. But wait, there's more, and it just gets better. My now ex-friend attempted to extort me. Yep, he told me on the 4th of July this year that I had 2 choices. The first was as follows: that I must shut down my channel here on YouTube, wiping out 7 years worth of work across 85 videos, where I speak on the topic of how I go about my work and demonstrate various handy hints and tips, as well as discuss my processes in the discipline of proper model making. Okay, so it's a microscopic channel with barely 4.7 thousand subscribers, but I grew it with almost no promotion, no funding, nothing. Just me and the tools that I have to hand working in a very unsuitable space, simply talking to a group of like-minded community members because I like to share my work with those who are kind enough to show some interest in what I do. In addition to that, I must also delete my Facebook page where, since 2016, I've shown all my work-in-progress pictures and shared my thoughts on proper model making history. Finally, the last instruction was that I should cease all work, projects, commissions, and any plans for products going forward, effectively wiping out any and all potential income streams that I may have. My second choice was that I could continue as before, but pay him a hefty royalty fee on everything that I do going forward. This includes the sales of any and all items that I may do runs on, private singular sales, any freelance work that I may take on, and finally that he would take all the revenue from my channel, which is, to be honest, probably no more than £100 or so per year. Obviously, all this is both totally unacceptable and morally reprehensible. Now, the problem is that I have no real way to fight this. On paper, he has everything. You may quite rightly ask, why didn't I register all this myself earlier? Well, the truth is that I was going to, but it was just a matter of timing. I had a plan that as of the final quarter of 2023, I was going to register PB Props and Models as a business and have a website with a shop populated with all my products, a portfolio of my past work, and everything was going to be officially launched partway through 2024. The sole goal of this was to allow me to make some sales with the aim to raise enough capital to pay off a lump sum towards my mortgage, which in turn would allow our monthly repayments to be lowered. And my ex-friend knew this. He was privy to all my plans. At the time, I had no way of knowing that he'd do any of this. In fact, it still puzzles me now as to why he did this in the first place, as I did nothing illegal. And certainly nothing was done to harm him by me in any way, shape or form. This really did come out of the blue. Currently, his threats hang over me like this sword of Damocles, and I just don't have the money to hire a solicitor, as my income has dwindled to almost zero since last year because of his and his friends' actions. And I certainly wasn't able to pay off that lump sum towards my mortgage, which has now put my family under a considerable financial strain, I might add. So I just have to sit here and wait for his next move and hope that we don't lose the house in the process. At any moment, he could tell YouTube that he owns PB Props and Models and insist that I cease all operations here. I've already been warned by him that I should expect a cease and desist letter from his solicitors, but so far this has not happened. The worst part is that I tried to warn him in 2023 and again in 2024 that his new friend was up to no good and that he'd even confessed to faking a will. But no, my ex-friend simply wouldn't have it, even though there is considerable documented proof. I can only think of a handful of scenarios that could explain his position. The first is that he was in on it right from the very beginning, where he was blinded by the greed of what he was getting out of the whole deal, as he did end up with some highly valuable and very desirable screen use items from his favourite TV show. The second scenario is that he wasn't aware of what his friend was up to until I told him. But by this stage he'd already received several key items, and to admit that the fraud was genuine would cement the idea that what he was in receipt of was actually stolen property, which he'd ultimately have to hand back. Or lastly, that he was just so incredibly stupid and naive about his friend and what he was up to, that he created a sort of reality denial cloud to explain in more acceptable terms as to what was going on here. You know, it's sort of softening the blow and making the facts seem more palatable. At the end of the day, who knows? But if scenario 1 is really true, that he was in on it from the very beginning, then that would upset me no end. No matter how you look at it though, it just doesn't look good for him. I mean, think about it. It doesn't take a legal expert to realise that you cannot legally own something from someone's estate before probate is granted. It just doesn't work like that. And that's exactly what happened here during the early stages right after Andrew Hopkinson's death in 2021. Later the will was accepted and probate was granted, and yes, that sort of made everything look above board and tickety-boo. But then how do you explain that probate was subsequently revoked just months later? Oh, and by the way, it's a matter of public record that this did actually happen, so you can even look it up for yourself if you're that interested. The details can be found on the UK government's website under the probate search function. If you do try this out, you'll discover that as of September 2024, no matching results will be returned. So, could it be that Dan and I were right all along? That the will really was a forgery, just as we'd said? Either way, it deeply saddens me to say that my ex-friend has shown himself for who he really is. A two-faced, backstabbing, self-absorbed narcissist who's only out for what he can get from other people, whilst bragging about the amount of things that he owns during his ongoing campaign of self-promotion. He genuinely seems to think that just because he has a bit of money, which he inherited from his own family, that he can simply steal and destroy other people's livelihoods whilst bullying them and making threats without anyone ever finding out. Does he honestly think that there would be no recourse to this? He really isn't the happy-go-lucky chap that he purports to be. In fact, he's a user who is solely out for himself. As soon as your usefulness to him ceases, he'll drop you like a hot potato and move on to his next mark. I once asked him a few years ago why we didn't talk so much anymore, and do you know what he told me? build more stuff then. That combined with his lies and his going behind my back multiple times, which I always turned a blind eye to, just sealed the deal. It was over as far as I was concerned. But I didn't know how to go about it. In the end, though, he did it for me. Well, I've remained silent for too long. I've taken the abuse, the damage to my reputation, and the total loss of an income since April of 2023, and now I'm going to have my say. For context, I have to tell you about the late Andrew Hopkinson, whose estate all this centres on. Andrew was a prop and model maker who worked for the BBC visual effects department throughout the 1980s, 1990s and beyond. He was also an avid collector, and over the years he had amassed an enviable collection of original props, models, costumes, moulds and design schematics from a variety of television and film franchises, ranging from Doctor Who, Blake Seven and the Tripods, to Batman, Alien and Judge Dredd, to name but a few. His collection was worth a lot of money, easily well beyond £100,000 at the very least. Primarily, he focuses his attentions on Doctor Who and Blake Seven, and just to give you a taster of what he had, here's an interview with Andrew about the Blake Seven side of his collection from a 1999 episode of the Channel 4 programme Collector's Lot.
You're clearly into Blake Seven in a big way, Andy. How did it start?
Well, it was in my early teens, actually. That's when Blake Seven started, I think, in '78. It caught my imagination at the time, really. It was something very different. The designs were distinctive, which was one thing that caught my eye. It's basically like a Robin Hood in space, led by Blake.
That'll be me.
Indeed. And he took control of a fantastic spaceship called the Liberator, and they waged war against the Federation.
For those that saw the last episode, the Liberator actually blew up as well, so this can't be the original set.
No, this was a set that I built for a convention last year.
And when you come to try to find genuine bits and pieces then, I mean, where do you get that from?
The BBC had quite a few auctions years ago, so they sold lots and lots of things off, including lots of costumes and props, and that's mainly where a lot of the things come from.
Can you remember the first piece you collected?
I think it was the Travis costume. That was at the first auction I went to. I had been to previous auctions before then, but not bought anything. I don't know why I bought that one, but I haven't looked back.
So let's have a look at the paraphernalia.
The small one at the side of it, that's an original one. It's from an episode called Gambit, where they had to miniaturise Aurak to actually get it inside a casino. They wanted to break the bank and win a lot of money.
And what about the spaceship just in front there?
Oh yes, well that's from only one episode actually. It's very well detailed for just for a one-off ship.
And what about these teleport braces that were used?
They made quite a few of these because I think everybody on the show, the guest artists and everyone, walked off the show with one. When they got to the end of the first season, they had about 3 left.
Who would wear these other costumes around the show?
Well, this particular one is a mutoid, which is a bit similar to a Federation Guard, only a female version of that, really. That's another Avon one. The white dress there, that one is by the villain, Servalan, and that's a very nice example of that.
And where did the artwork come from?
Well, this is from several artists, actually. Some there for a magazine cover, and some of the other ones are for The Logic of Empire, which was an audio production.
And is there anything you're still after?
Well, there are a few designs that I particularly like. A particular designer on the show, quite a flamboyant, theatrical style designer. She designed some very flamboyant outfits. She has all her original pastel artwork, which is very nice.
So I've got to ask you, I mean, it's a big collection. Where do you keep it? It doesn't fit in the average semi.
No, that's true, yes. There's several big garages, actually, apart from Zen, who leans up against several big garages.
We've already established that at the end of the series, at the very end, everybody gets shot and the whole thing blows up. Good job that doesn't happen in real life.
Unfortunately for Andrew, during the last 20 or so years of his life, he was in poor health, and it was widely questioned within the prop-making community why he'd never written a will, given that he was the last of his close family's line. Obviously, many people wondered where his collection would end up, but the answer was never forthcoming. We just accepted that he'd not thought that far ahead, or that he simply didn't want to think about it, which was totally understandable. That said, there was an unofficial gentleman's agreement between 2 of his friends, the fraudster, who will now be referred to as Person A for the rest of this video, and the aforementioned Dan O'Keefe. The agreement was that in the event of Andrew's death, Person A would take all of the Blake 7 models, props and costumes, while Dan would receive all the Doctor Who pieces, and then between them, the rest would be divvied up. Everyone just sort of accepted this, as we all believed that Andrew had plenty of time to sort his affairs out in due course. But alas, as is always the case surrounding Andrew, the years rolled on by and nothing was officially put into place. After the death of his mother in 2019 and his father a few years before that, Andrew fell into a mild depression and, to all intents and purposes, abandoned his flat in London and moved back north to his family home in Chesterfield, Derbyshire, leaving his partner behind. In early July of 2021, Andrew's partner repeatedly called and texted Andrew, but could never make contact. Given that the weekend was approaching, he just sort of assumed that Andrew must be busy or otherwise engaged. However, as the hours became days and the weekend came and went, and with still no word from him, Andrew's partner grew increasingly concerned, so much so that the only thing he could think of to do was to call Person A, who lived closer to Andrew and had a spare set of keys, and request that he do a welfare check on him. Arriving at the property, Person A discovered Andrew deceased in his bed. Later, Person A allegedly recounted the events that unfolded on that fateful day to mutual friends. It's claimed that on finding Andrew deceased, before even calling the emergency services, he immediately began to fill his car with what he considered as top-tier props, models and costumes from the Blake 7 franchise, joking that he apologised to Andrew's corpse as he stepped around him while gathering these items up. To the abject horror of those listening, his reasoning for doing this was that he apparently feared that the police would confiscate the keys to the property, thus cutting off his access to all that memorabilia contained within, especially the Blake 7 items that he so greatly wanted for himself. This would be the start of his rather questionable behaviour. Almost immediately, Person A enlisted the help of several people to assist him and Dan to clear the bungalow of everything, enacting the previously mentioned agreement between himself and Dan. One of the first things that Dan did, much to his utmost credit, was to attempt to identify all the items within the collection that Andrew had actually borrowed from other collectors, so that they could be safely returned to their rightful owners. Dan even asked me to assist in this by guiding him on what to look out for, as well as to identify any pieces that he wasn't too familiar with. Now, it has to be pointed out at this juncture that probate had not been granted to Person A at all, and there appeared to be no will left with Andrew's instructions on what to do with his estate. However, Person A was named in Andrew's late mother's will, which he claimed gave him the authority to handle all the affairs. There is more to this, and we'll come back to it a bit later on in this video. But to bolster his actions of clearing the property, Person A reasoned that his motive was altruistic, in that the bungalow, because it was sat empty, it was there at high risk of being burgled, so everything was to be removed for safekeeping until the probate was officially granted to him. Keep this in mind. If this were truly the case, then why did he immediately start to sell off the pieces to specialist collectors? The reality was that he just wanted to get his hands on the property as soon as possible so that he could keep the items that he wanted and sell all the rest to line his pockets. Tellingly, anything that wasn't seen as having any monetary value was thrown away. This included Andrew's personal items, his clothes, his keepsakes, and even his family photographs. This I found to be quite objectionable and clearly demonstrated Person A's true motives. He wasn't interested in Andrew as a friend, but as a means to access the items that he wanted. Knowing this, I said to Dan that I felt quite uneasy about what was going on, and while I didn't want to come between him and Person A, I did feel that something was very badly amiss here on Person A's part, given that he was also knowingly keeping Andrew's partner out of the loop and doing the very same with Andrew's only living blood relative. The clearance continued throughout the summer of 2021 and into the Christmas of that year, and was completed by the Easter of 2022. And all through this, his behaviour continued to get more and more dubious, to the point that his greed was starting to get the better of him. In one of many incidences, he threatened to sell off a well-known collector's property that Andrew had borrowed if he wasn't given access to rare Blake 7 photographs in return. He called this a Person A tax. He was willing to sell a helmet to a specialist vendor as an original, even though it could well be a replica. And he saw nothing wrong in using the owner of a science fiction museum for his contacts with other high-rolling collectors. The goal here was to sell all of them items from Andrew's estate, as to him they were nothing more than cash cows. As his greed for money grew, it became the prime motivator for his every action, where Person A gradually and systematically began to dismantle Andrew's collection for personal profit, selling everything and anything that wasn't linked to Blake 7. In doing this, he completely ignored his late friend's wishes to retain the collection for future generations to have access to and to learn from, as part of a prop-building commune that he wanted to establish on his family's property, something that Andrew had often spoken about publicly. An indicator of Andrew's aim to keep his collection intact can be seen in this forum post from December of 2014, where he spoke about how an original screen-used tripod filming miniature will always remain with him. In his own words, Person A's aim was to become a millionaire, or very nearly, by breaking up his friend's collection. A collection that Andrew had spent a lifetime accumulating. On a cold winter's day in late November of 2021, 16 months prior to the day from hell, and just 4 months after the death of Andrew Hopkinson, Dan O'Keefe came to my house with a small number of items from Andrew's estate that he and Person A wanted me to deal with to varying degrees. The first were 6 fiberglass castings that, when combined, would make up the bulk of the trial ship filming miniature from a Doctor Who serial called The Trial of a Time Lord. Now, I was extremely familiar with this model, as it had been a long-time dream of mine to recreate this, and over the years I had spoken to Andrew about sharing my knowledge with him to turn these castings into a finished display piece. Unfortunately, as is always the case with Andrew in his later years, he just kind of dragged his feet over this kind of endeavour, primarily due to his ongoing struggle with his personal demons. And so it never came to pass, but now it had a new lease of life. I was prepared to give my time for free to this project to finally get the ball rolling on it, so that when completed it could be used in various public displays of Andrew's collection, that Person A and Dan were planning on staging around the country. The construction would be no easy task. It would entail a lot of scratch building and welding to get the fiberglass base structure to a finished state onto which the rest could be built. As for the surface detail, this would require the acquisition of many discontinued and rare vintage model kits to maintain the authentic screen-accurate look, but I was prepared to invest in these myself to get the job done. After all, I felt that this was a worthwhile cause. In fact, over the following months I'd researched and identified almost all of the kits as seen on the original, tracked them down and even purchased most of what was needed. This cost me just shy of £700 and I still had a lot more to obtain. Other items that came into my possession from the boys on that day were an original screen-used bazookoid prop from Red Dwarf, 2 Crichton heads from the same series, one screen-used and the other was a BBC reference copy that was cast in foam. And then there was a very rare red cybergun from a 1980s Doctor Who serial. These were not given to me as gifts, but rather for me to appraise, document and repair where necessary, as both Person A and Dan felt that these pieces could be let go. I didn't necessarily agree that they should be disposed of, as I felt Andrew's collection should be kept intact as much as possible, but at the end of the day it wasn't my call, and Dan did advise me that some of the sold items could be borrowed back, so fair enough, I thought. So, as a favour to help them both out, and to give me a bit of easy content for my YouTube channel, I would make a video of each item that would serve 2 functions. The first was to show to a wider audience how exactly such vintage BBC props were made back then, giving insights into the details that you'd never garner from mere photographs alone. And secondly, they were intended to showcase to any potential buyer what exactly the condition was of each piece. That, along with the thoughts that I gave during the video, could help them decide whether or not they were interested in making an offer. It does have to be pointed out here that I would not be financially benefiting from any sales gained as a direct result of my videos. I was just happy to give them a bit of free advertising in return for me being able to share such nice artefacts with my YouTube audience. As far as I was concerned, it was a win-win scenario for both me and Dan and Person A, and of course my wonderful subscribers. In the event, however, I only made 2 videos, one on the cybergun and the other on the bazookoid, and both served their purposes. Those 2 pieces found new homes, and along with the heads, they all left my possessions shortly afterwards. The last items that were brought to me were 2 extremely ancient silicone moulds. Both were from classic Doctor Who, with the first being Eldred's hand from The Hand of Fear, and the other was Morbius's brain from, you guessed it, The Brain in Morbius. Dan said to me at the time, and I quote, "These are absolutely knackered. See if you can get a cast out of each, then throw them away. They're no use in that condition anymore." Fair enough, I thought, and so I set them aside. The next day, on the 28th of November 2021, Person A texted Dan very early in the morning about the delivery trip to my house. Although garbled and somewhat unintelligible, you can still just about make out what he was trying to say. He asked Dan if he'd got here okay, then referenced the trial ship that he was somewhat unfamiliar with, not being a fan of the show, but he seemed quite impressed with just how big it actually was. The implication here was that he knew exactly what we'd planned for it. Later that same day, I briefly mentioned this project on my PB Props Models Facebook page, but Dan went into a little more detail on his page, and personally certainly saw that as he even liked the post. On the 14th of December 2021, I published the first video that would cover items from Andrew's estate. In this instance, it was the cybergun. It was received quite well by the viewers, and personally would even talk to Dan about it about a month later once Christmas was over in the January of 2022 via text. Here he said how interesting it was and that it was worth finding a new owner for with lots of wonga. There you see, only interested in how much money that he could get for it, as always. 2 days later, after that text, on the 15th of January 2022, I published the second video that would contain further elements from Andrew's estate. It was simply called Dream Projects. From 2 minutes and 45 seconds into it, I begin to talk about the trial ship project and how it's going to be a huge task to carry out, as well as being a rather expensive one to boot. I then spoke about the idea of having it out on display somewhere, which was a vague allusion to the notion of putting Andrew's collection up for public viewing at some kind of event. With that said, I didn't go into too much detail here because nothing had been fully planned yet, especially as personally kept selling off key items from the non-Blake 7 side of the collection, much to the chagrin of all who knew. The joke back then was that by the time we were ready, there'd be nothing left. Later on in the video, at 10 minutes and 45 seconds, I cover the two silicone moulds where I acknowledge on camera that while they are heading towards the end of their life, I still felt that I could get them to work despite Dan's earlier reservations where he'd pretty much written them off. I also referenced the possibility of doing a short run of cast that people could buy, as this was something that I previously discussed with Dan in Person A. If I could get a semi-decent cast out of each mould before they entirely broke down, then I could clean up those new casts and then use them to create a new set of moulds that I'd then make at my own expense. I would then sell off a few casts to recover my costs, and then return the new moulds to Dan and Person A whilst consigning the old ones to the bin of history as originally directed. Seems fair, right? Well, anyway, it didn't really matter at this point, as it's all up in the air anyway, because I'd not really looked into the logistics of it all yet, and effectively I do say this at the end of that section of the video. A few days later, I called Dan with a new idea. Having got the moulds out to shoot that video, edit and publish it, I now had the opportunity to properly inspect them. Rather than casually throw them away after pulling the reference casts from them as originally planned, I now firmly believe that I could actually restore both moulds. This would mean that I'd actually have to take some slightly drastic actions with them by cutting away all the serious damage, glue new sections in, stitch together larger tears and splits that were already there from decades of use, and then find all the weak spots by running the moulds with resin to see where it'd tear next, patch that up, and then keep going until the tears stopped happening. Obviously, this would mean that I would end up with a number of useless castings, and almost straight away Dan said that I could make these casts good, paint them up and sell them off to cover my expenses and time. Again, it seems fair. I waited a few days for Dan to confirm that all was good between he and Person A, and the word that came back was, go. Well, hold on to those many horses of yours, my dear chums. I've got my own things to do first, but I'll get to those moulds at some point. The next video to go up came 2 months later on the 20th of March 2022, where I spoke about that original bazookoid prop from Red Dwarf. I didn't really hear much from Person A about this, other than Dan telling me that he'd seen it and thought it was quite good and that he'd be keeping an eye on my channel for further updates. For the next 9 months, I was busy with my own projects, and it wasn't until the December the 14th, 2022 that I was able to tackle anything from Andrew's estate again. This time around, it was a video called Is This Silicone Mould Beyond Repair? It effectively dealt with the first pass repairs of each of those silicone moulds that would enable me to cast up the first test pieces to see exactly what I was dealing with. There I focused primarily on repairing the major splits, voids and tears to the hand mould, as that was the easiest and the most visually striking of the two to film effectively. At 14 minutes and 17 seconds in, I show the two new casts, a hand and a brain, and I have to say that it's rather obvious that I was somewhat excited by the fact that the repairs had worked and that the moulds were now viable enough to carry on with. However, I knew there was still much further work to be done on them in terms of repairing the micro tears, but as that wouldn't make for good visual entertainment, I just left it out. That said, I did hint at this and even mentioned that very possibly I'd have a little run of castings as a result of this work, which I'd make available when the time comes. And there the video ended. If you're interested in seeing these videos, I'll leave links to them in the description for you to follow up on at your own leisure, but they will add weight to what I'm telling you here. As Christmas of that year loomed, things went quiet on that front until I was ready to start work on the repairs in the February of 2023. Rather than make a highly impractical video on this, I simply updated everyone with my progress on Facebook. Here I spoke about the highs and lows of how things were proceeding. Initially I was very positive that this would work, but as each new casting brought about new tears in the mould from the discovery of further weak spots, I began to worry that there'd end up being more repair work than original mould. With that in mind, I decided to call it a day after the 10th repair. The silicone was just too fragile, and so I opted to abandon the idea of making them completely viable again, and settled on just fixing them to a state where they could be retired and retained for posterity. This now obviously left me with 10 castings that I didn't need nor want, and given the arrangement with both Dan and Person A about a year earlier, I set about making the cast good, cleaning them up and turning them into finished pieces that I could sell off to recover my expenses and the time that I spent on them. I did this in 2 batches of 5 over several weeks, primarily because I just did not have the space to work on 10 in one go. Then that fateful day arrived. Monday, March the 27th, 2023. It was a shit show from start to finish. By the end of the day, I'd been battered so much from every side with a barrage of crap that I seriously thought that I'd been kicked unceremoniously into the shadow realm. It began first thing in the morning with a trip to a specialist cardiologist where we learned that our son had a heart condition that would affect his health for the rest of his life, in that if he wasn't too careful, he could actually have a heart attack and potentially die. Obviously, as parents, this was devastating news, but we'd cope with it by making some lifestyle changes. From there, I had to deal with an errant builder who was supposedly coming to finish off some work on a house, but was being rather uncommunicative and had conveniently disappeared with our deposit. That was tedious and frustrating to put right. Then I had to comfort a friend of mine who had just suffered 2 losses in his family, so I spent some time giving him support, as I'd been through this myself with my own father. Later that afternoon, I received a panicked phone call from my elderly mother. Now, she has her own health issues given her age, but she was also facing a major surgery that she'd been waiting several years for. In preparation for this, she'd been to see a doctor that morning, and as a direct result of something that he told her about another of her ailments, she now believed that she had throat cancer. It took a while to get her to simmer down and relax, and I assured her that whatever was going on, we'd deal with it. This seemed to help, and off she went to prepare for her operation that was due in the next day or so. No sooner had I placed the receiver down than the phone rang again. I was exhausted both physically and emotionally after such a shit day, but against my better judgment, I answered, and even before a single word was uttered from whoever was on the end of the line, I could tell that they were pissed off, and so I stilled myself for an ear bashing. And then it began, all brash and bullshit in a very threatening tone. "Is that Anthony Sibley?" the nasally voice on the other end of the line said. "Yes." "Well, I'm the Person A. Do you know who I am?" he demanded. He then went on to say that he'd got my number from his very dear friend Person B, my now ex-friend. Yes, he was so very dear to him that he completely got his surname wrong, which I corrected him on. He then went on to rant and rave and berate me about the fact that, according to him, I had no right to sell these castings and that Dan also had no right to allow me to do this in the first place. He then aggressively went on to tell me that all the other items that I'd been given was done so without his knowledge or permission, and that Dan was nothing more than just the storage. In his rage, he informed me that Andrew Hopkinson's estate, in its entirety, was in no uncertain terms his and his alone, as it was all bequeathed to him and that he was the sole heir. Okay then. But when I pressed him for what had changed between the agreement of the previous year and now, he told me that there never was any such agreement to start with, and that Dan had gone and done all this behind his back. This was obviously clearly untrue. If there was really no agreement, then why would I have been so public on both YouTube and Facebook about the restorations that I was doing for him? Additionally, why did I also make those videos for both him and Dan where I talked about the up-and-coming projects in great detail, as well as the fluff pieces to drum up interest in the items that they were selling? To give Person A the benefit of the doubt here, just for a moment, if Dan really had gone behind his back and then lied to me about it all, this too would make no sense, as Dan knew that I would be speaking about the work on both my YouTube channel and on my work page where everyone could see it. The risk of being found out here would be far too high for him, plus he'd be deliberately putting me into an untenable situation where we'd both be caught out almost immediately. But we weren't. I had been openly talking about this since November of 2021, with Person A's full knowledge, as he'd been keeping an eye on my channel. Even Person B, his friend and my now ex-friend, knew precisely what I was up to, as he even mentioned it in a jokey text conversation where he was telling me about a project that he was currently working on. None of this jives with me and Dan going behind anyone's back. In fact, it's quite the opposite. Further still, if I was doing this in the full knowledge that there was no permission in a devious attempt to scam Person A, then I too would have been extraordinarily stupid to do this so very obviously out in the open, where again everyone would be witness to what I was up to. I just didn't bother to tell him that there was evidence of him knowing precisely what I was doing, as it became very apparent that all he was focusing on was the fact that I was making a very small amount of money, which he wasn't getting a piece of. Seemingly, he valued all those weeks and months that I spent of my time repairing these items for him, I remind you, at precisely zero. And he certainly didn't even bother to consider all the materials and the sundries that I bought to make all this possible. No, above everything, it was the money that he was interested in. He wanted it for himself, regardless of my time and expenditure. In the end, I just about had enough of all this nonsense. Given his very rude and abrasive attitude, especially since this was our maiden interaction, which didn't make for a positive first impression, I'm compelled to say, I was no longer willing to continue discussing this with him any further, and so I advised him that he should take the matter up with Dan, as it was clearly an issue between the pair of them, and not with me. I did call Dan straight away, and he was shocked by what I was telling him, but he revealed to me that Person A did have form for this kind of behaviour. In the meantime, he suggested that I should just sit tight until he got back from his business trip that he was about to embark on, where he'd talk to Person A and try and sort all this out. The very next day, I awoke to this threatening Facebook message from my new best buddy, Person A.
Hello, Anthony. After speaking to you and your not concerned attitude, I will be speaking to my solicitor to get the sale of these hands stopped. I will be wanting a percentage of all sold if you go ahead without my permission.
So which is it to be then? He's going to get his solicitors to stop me, but then by the same token he also wants a percentage cut of all the items sold, if I ignore his demands and continue as before. So it's some very, very mixed messages there. Person A was good to his word in that I did indeed receive a letter from his solicitor 5 days after his threat, on what seemed like quite an appropriate day, April the 1st, April Fool's Day, as clearly this was a joke. The first thing that I noticed was that there was no official company letterhead, no reference number, and certainly no SRA number that all solicitors are given when they pass the bar and have to register. While there was an attempt at some officious-sounding language, it just read like someone with amateur legal aspirations was having a go. A bit like when a child plays teacher and takes the register of all their dollies. Not once did they refer to themselves as a solicitor, but they did attempt to sound like one as they aired Person A's grievances with me. The author of this mighty tome then proceeded to demand a reply within 14 days to arrange the return of the mould because, according to them, the estate of Andrew Hopkinson had given me no such authority to hold or use these items for profit. Again, my time and expenses were worth absolutely nothing then. That's gratitude for you. The letter ended on a mild threat of further action should I fail to return these items, though it was said in a less than articulate way. I barely had any time to breathe and fully digest this joke when almost a week later the second novelty letter arrived on my doorstep. This one conceded that the 14-day limit had not yet elapsed, but they were now interested in further items in my possession, chiefly the Red Dwarf bazookoid gun, the 2 Crichton heads from the same series, plus the trial ship castings from Doctor Who. However, this time the accusations were more direct, in that they were suggesting that I took them with no authority and no intention of ever returning them, which they would consider to be theft. If ever I've had a case of the pot calling the kettle black, then this one certainly took the top prize, and I'd certainly like to see them prove that I physically took these items, as I have never once set foot in Andrew's bungalow. Yes, I've known him for 20 years, spoken to him on the phone, exchanged emails, and had the odd meal with him. But we weren't friends in my consideration, more like associates with similar interests and skill sets. To be accused with such lies and to question my honesty somewhat rankled with me, and so I rattled off a very matter-of-fact and direct email reply to this cosplay solicitor. You can pause this video and read my reply, but in essence I questioned her authority as she had not proven exactly who she was. Additionally, she'd also certainly not shown any evidence that she had any legal right to make the claims that she was making. I also explained why I would not be returning anything to her, but I will, and had already done so, returned items to my client, Mr. Dan O'Keefe, as he was the only individual that I had any legal obligations to. I then said that any further communications from either herself or from person A will be seen as harassment, and will be reported accordingly. Now, rather stupidly, she did reply further with the proof that I wanted, albeit it was a very small photograph of the certificate of probate, but this was contained within another email to an actual solicitor who was dealing with the estate of Andrew's mother. I don't think that she actually realised this, but in that email was information that would be quite revealing and would certainly expose what was actually going on here. The cosplay solicitor explained to the real solicitor that there was no money in Andrew's estate, that he was in substantial rent arrears for his London flat, and that his bank account barely had £100 in it. Additionally, he also owed more than £3,000 on his credit card. She then went on to explain how all of Andrew's perishables and personal items had been removed from his property. Now, this backed up something else we'd heard them claim, that the only items of monetary value in Andrew's estate was, laughably, a mobile phone and a personal computer. To put it bluntly, Person A and the cosplay solicitor appear to be concealing the existence of Andrew's vast collection, something that could easily have been sold off or auctioned off to cover his debts. I mean, they obviously knew that it had value, because Person A even sent Dan and I a list of items that they wanted back, complete with his wildly over-the-top evaluations of their worth, as well as his usual garbled use of the English language. The proceeds from this list alone, or those from the items that Person A had already sold off, could easily have covered Andrew's debts, yet so far this was not happening. So why was there never any mention or recognition that this collection even existed? Certainly none of the actual solicitors were even aware of it either. What was clearly being hinted at here within this email was that Person A and the cosplay solicitor needed to know what the trust that controlled Andrew's mother's estate was going to do next, and whether or not they were going to sign it over to them. The implication being that Andrew's mother's estate could cover the cost of these debts, because, on paper, Andrew's was valueless. Seeing this, Dan and I immediately had massive suspicions that a fraud was indeed in progress, and so we did a bit of digging. I spoke to Thames Valley Police and the Solicitors Regulation Authority. The SRA confirmed that the cosplay solicitor was absolutely not on their records, and both they and Thames Valley Police suggested that if our suspicions were true, and that a fraud currently was in progress, then all of the items disseminated from Andrew's estate would now be considered as stolen property, no matter who had received it, including whether they'd been gifted these items or bought them from Person A. I was advised that nothing should be returned to Person A, and that I should either hold on to the items that I have or return them to Dan until they can be returned to the rightful owner, once that person is identified. Now, don't worry, we were already on to that. Currently, this whole debacle will be seen as a civil matter, but if that will really was a forgery and can be unequivocally proven as such, then it would become a criminal matter. I was then further advised to cease any and all work on those moulds and to remove any reference to them from any social media pages that I control. I did as I was told, largely, and immediately deleted all the Facebook posts where I spoke openly about the mould restorations, but I left the YouTube videos where they were, as they were far too valuable to me to simply remove. Further to this, both Dan and I were advised to cease any and all communications with Person A and anyone connected to him. That we did. I blocked all those involved on Facebook and WhatsApp, plus I blocked their phone numbers on my landline and my mobile too. I assumed Dan did the same. Then it came, the bombshell. We obtained a copy of Andrew's will. When we looked at it, the first thing that struck us was that it was so very obviously a blatant forgery. Personally, I was surprised that it didn't have the phrase, "this is a fake" or "written for comedic purposes only" plastered all over it. It was true. Those were committing a fraud, and one on a massive scale as well. Knowing that his threats over the phone, via texts, emails and through the cosplay solicitor were just not working on Dan and I in the way that he envisaged, Person A resorted to the only thing left available to him: complaining on the internet. A bit like this video, but with less truth, lots of lies and large doses of sympathy fishing, whilst throwing us under the bus and making some very spurious claims about us. And it worked to a degree, especially as Dan and I had to remain publicly silent while we gathered evidence in the background. Just a week or two after Dan and I had received those solicitors' letters, Person A decided to throw up variations of a pity post on his personal Facebook page and within the various community pages that he was a part of. And here it is. Let's see if we can decipher what he's trying to say in his broken pidgin English and question the points that he raises, or at the very least translate them into some truthful statements. It's been nearly 2 years since my dear friend the late Andrew Hopkinson passed away. It was decided to clear Andrew's mother's Jean's bungalow out on what an enormous task it was to be. Well, a severe lack of grammar and punctuation there, but I think what he's trying to say is that he chanced his luck by clearing out the bungalow of Andrew's valuable memorabilia so that he could keep the bits that he wanted and sell off the rest to the highest bidder, something that he did from day one. Why? Because there was every chance that the fraudulent will that he had created and submitted to the authorities may not actually go through, thus cutting off his access to all that good stuff. So it's best to get in there first, illegally and all that, but tell everyone that he had the authority to do this. All the props and molds would be taken away for safekeeping until the estate and probate was awarded. Well, that's a very bold move. He's just publicly admitted to committing an act of theft. Under UK law, nothing can be touched or removed from anyone's estate before probate is awarded. Well, like they say, to make a lie seem believable, wrap it up in an element of truth. What an idiot. Right, this next one's a bit more difficult for me to try and read. It really is mangled, but here we go. I turned to someone who lived near Rochdale to help. In mind he knew Andrew himself. This task took many, many hours and lots of weekends while he went through everything with a fine-tooth pick in a Luton van and 30 full car loads over the year. It was a large haul. Ugh. Oh lordy, where to even start on this one? Well, aside from the near doxing of where Dan lived at the time and the mangled idiomatic expression that you've used there, it's fine-tooth comb, not a toothpick, you fucking moron. That doesn't even make sense. But yes, you just sat back and let Dan do most of the heavy lifting, and you didn't even bother to cover any of his expenses, such as the van hire and the diesel that he used to run it, where he transported the haul, as you call it, up and down the motorway over that year. And neither did you cover his petrol expenses that he incurred while he ferried things around for you in his car as well. All sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Valuing people's time and expenses at absolutely zero. Over the past year or so, my so-called friend has been selling things off. Yes, he did, but it was only a fraction of what you sold from the very get-go before you even had probate. Dan was under the impression from all the lies that you told him that all this was above board, which it wasn't, and you knew damn well that it wasn't. It just goes to show what kind of friend you were to him. Anyway, he continues on with the nonsense. And lending moulds to a certain prop maker to reproduce items out of the Tom Baker stories. This prop maker has no right to do this and does not have permission from the late Andrew Hopkinson estate. Well, aside from the fact that you were defrauding that estate yourself, you conveniently seem to forget that deal that we had, where I'd repair these moulds at no cost to you and that I'd recover my expenditure by selling off the resulting cast from the repair process. I've already covered this in great detail, so moving on. Both of these gentlemen have been asked to return the borrowed items, which they are not doing. They have blocked me on the media and have no contact with me to return such items. Okay, so which is it? Did we steal the items or borrow the items? It can't be both. And yes, we severed all contact with you because we were legally advised to do so by a number of reputable sources, included but not limited to 2 independent solicitors, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, and Thames Valley Police, to name but a few. The very fact that you faked a will made you a thief, and we were not going to help you carry out this caper to its completion, okay? He continues. Most of you would know these guys, so please share this post if you think it was a betrayal of my good will. Your Honour, that's leading the witness. Leave a like if you love your mother. So, that's the tactics you're using now, is it? Blatant manipulation of people's emotions? Don't forget, 1 thumbs up, it's a prayer to God. Oh, boo bloody who, you're lying to everyone here with your tall stories and your fraudulent activities. Isn't this a betrayal of everyone else's goodwill? I think you'll find that it is. Anyway, as desired, Person A got the sympathy that he craved from the gullible responders who suggested things like he should call the police, like he'd even dare to do that, or that he should enlist the services of a solicitor to put the fear of God into us. Luckily for me, I'm an atheist with a significant stack of proof of Person A's fraudulent deeds in my back pocket, much of it from his own mouth. He did, however, suffer a bit of an unexpected blowback to his pity post, where a couple of people did call him out on his actions, most notably from the well-known collector who you may recall from Chapter 2, where Person A tried to blackmail him. Here was what that collector had to say.
Hi, Person A. I don't understand this. When I spoke to you at Small Space last year, you told me if I bought anything from him, that's Dan, that there was a Person A tax and you wanted 50% of all sales. Glad I didn't buy anything now. The person in question did, however, return to me quite happily some props and molds that I had lent Andy many years ago, for which I was asked to send you photos of Paul Darrow. If I didn't give you those, you threatened to sell off my property. As I understand it, you have also been selling off much of Andy's collection. Please don't throw stones from glass houses.
Now, this ruffled Person A's feathers to such a degree that he tried to get this collector to call him, but his request went ignored. 10 minutes later, he further tried to excuse himself with this grovelling message, which again went ignored.
Hi, I'm not pursuing anything back. I don't have proof of ownership. Yes, I did say Person A tax, but Dan didn't stick to his word. Lending molds to prop makers was never agreed. Everything Dan tried to do was behind my back. He only had to ask me. I never threatened over a few photos. I knew that Dalek gun was and you was always going to get your stuff back, which Dan did. I am the executor of Andy's will, A. I needed to say something. Hope this makes sense. Regards, Person A.
I'm not even going to bother trying to address the massive contradictions there, and so I'll just leave his own garbled words to speak for themselves. Now, while this was going on, behind the scenes where Person A's little world was starting to unravel around him, his pity post out in the open directly led to rumours and lies being spread about both me and Dan, which had a significant impact on my personal ability to make a living. It dropped to 0. Cheers for that. I even had a number of people privately come to me to ask if all this were true. Of course, I told them that it wasn't, but for now, my hands were tied and I couldn't say anything as a case was being built against Person A and his cronies. But it was going to take time, and a lot of it, because, as we all know, solicitors move at a glacial speed. This enforced silence was brutal. My character was being eviscerated from all sides, including from people who I thought were my friends, and, in particular, that last aspect was soul-destroying. To me, it felt that out of everyone involved, I was the one who was being punished the most, including having my income snatched away from me, simply for offering my services for free to a complete stranger. It got to a stage where I suffered quite a severe nervous breakdown as a result. In one of many instances, I, as PB Props and Models, was being discussed on a prop building board where the administrator felt completely at ease in perpetuating the lies that he'd heard. I had no right of reply because I was not a member there, so everything went unchallenged. Put simply, I just don't do fandom sites these days, and I haven't done so since about 2010, because generally, fan boards are insidious cesspits comprised of glory seekers, wannabes, gatekeepers, all of whom I have absolutely no desire to mix with. Now, I'm not suggesting that every member is like this, by the way, but certainly a large quantity of them are. So did it occur to this pious bastard of a board administrator to make any contact with me and ask me for my side of the story? No, of course not. He was just happy to sit from the safety of his keyboard and stir the shit, acting all holier than thou. At the very least, a couple of people stood up for me there, so thank you very much to them for that. I appreciate it, I really do. Unfortunately, the damage was already done, and it was about to get far, far worse. You know, I'm a pretty laid-back, optimistic sort of fella, and I don't usually let things get to me, even when friends or distant acquaintances do things that I think aren't quite acceptable. Like, for instance, when they take my stuff that I've loaned to them and they then loan it to other people for duplication without my knowledge, or pass off information about prop-making techniques as their own when actually it was something that I developed and told them. But there is a tipping point when you can cross a line with me, though to get there you really have to make an effort and go out of your way. When Person A published his pity post, my now ex-friend ventured steadfastly into that territory with sheer vigour. Stupidly, I still tried to protect him, even though everyone was telling me not to because he was so obviously deeply entrenched with Person A and his activities. But I wanted to believe that there must be a mistake somewhere here, that there had to be a good explanation for all of this, and that maybe he was being lied to as well. Unfortunately, these thoughts proved entirely futile. It turns out that behind the jovial facade, he really was just a monumental through and through. On the 28th of April 2023, he began to show his true colours when I received this WhatsApp message from him. It was a screen grab of person A's pity post with a single red question mark underneath it. I simply replied, "You know he's talking nonsense, don't you?" and left it at that. The next day his reply came just a little after midday. "No, I don't. You better explain. Quickly." Ooh, get her trying to be all threatening like she's some kind of 1920s gangland mobster boss. Look, I found pissing in the wind to be more worrisome than this, and so I didn't bother replying. Instead, I just waited for the inevitable phone call that he'd place, as he's genuinely that predictable. About an hour or so later, as expected, the phone rang, and it was him, of course. It began with all the usual pleasantries and platitudes of asking how each other was and how things were going, but I could sense the unease in his voice, and so I said to him, "Just ask me the question that you so desperately want to ask." And so he did. With that, I told him the full story, that I'd offered person A my services at no cost to him, that we'd had an agreement on how I could recoup my costs, and how within the space of less than, say, 1 year, his attitude and behaviour had completely changed, so much so that he began to make threats, demands, and was generally that abusive to Dan and I that we began to suspect that something wasn't quite right here. My so-called friend then began to berate me about just how awful and hateful Dan was, suggesting that he's always been a thief and that he's completely untrustworthy. There was lots of colourful language going on at this point. To be frank, he was absolutely seething with barely contained rage, as he really laid into Dan's character, to the point that I was sure that he was starting to froth at the mouth, or was at the very least in danger of having yet another stroke. Anyway, I had to interject and inform him that as a result of all this, we'd uncovered person A's fraud, that the will was a forgery, and now the rightful heir had come into the picture. But he just wouldn't have it, and he denied this to be the case. I also told him that the solicitors were now involved, and that the police had advised all of us that any items removed from Andrew's estate was now considered as stolen property, including the pieces that he had personally received. "So, you're not going to give him the stuff back then?" "No, it's all stolen property. I've literally just told you that. It has to go back to the rightful heir." That was all I could tell him. He just didn't get it.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
Did you just lie to me? Anyway, I suggested to my friend that we should just stay out of it, remain calm, and leave the solicitors to do their thing, as they can sort this whole sorry mess out themselves, as that's what they're being paid to do. And there the call ended. Not long afterwards, my chum began to text me further on WhatsApp. Now, I'm not going to read it all, but I'll put the images up and you can pause it and read them at your leisure. Suffice to say that it started out fairly innocuously, but gradually it became more and more tense and suddenly rather weird, where he actually threatened to make a public statement about us, as in me and Dan, and dox us in the process. What I can't quite wrap my head around here is why he had to interject himself into the centre of the situation and seemingly make it all about him in the first place. Worse still was that nothing was ever actually done to him by any of us. Maybe he just felt threatened because of the distinct possibility that he may lose all the stuff that he'd been given, just as I would. But to be honest, I'd far rather hand stuff back over having something in my possession that's classed as stolen, regardless of how nice it might be. To be clear though, I only received a couple of moulds and a small number of unfinished castings to work on as a favour to person A, but no screen-used items like person B did, so maybe he felt that he had more to lose than I did. Who knows? The rest of what happened after this you already know, as I covered this in the first chapter here. This is where, for some reason, in the summer of 2023, my friend began his campaign of hatred towards me, as I was the only person that could inflict any meaningful damage on in his petty and vindictive act of revenge. As you know, he took it upon himself to officially register everything connected to my business, but did it in his name to prevent me from using it for the betterment of my family as part of me moving PB Props and Models to the next stage in its existence. He filed it as a limited company under his name with Companies House, the UK government's official business register. He also took the web domain addresses and registered PB Props and Models as a trademark linked to the company that he'd founded. Now, what I found slightly amusing was that during the final meeting that we had on the 4th of July 2024, person B produced a printout of a Facebook post that I had made on the 4th of October 23, where I explained to my followers what he'd done, without actually naming him. With a distinct flourish of the wrist, he unfolded this piece of paper, then he read it out to me in a very pointed manner. For some reason, he took extreme umbrage at the fact that I called him out on his own actions, as if to say, "How dare you expose me to the world with the truth of what I've done?" Thing is, anyone with an internet connection can look this stuff up and see exactly what he's done for themselves. You just can't hide official registrations like this. They're out there for all to see, just like the probate records and anyone's will. What he also really didn't like was the fact that Dan replied to my post and actually named him and Person A directly. You should have seen the glaring eyebrow daggers that he was shooting at me, as if this were all my fault. I mean, I cannot control what Dan, or anyone else for that matter, posts publicly on the internet. It just doesn't work like that. The truth of the matter was, with his registering of the company, the trademark and the domain names, is that he never actually intended to use any of them. They've all laid dormant and inactive ever since the day of their registration. He just didn't want me to have them. What he's really done here is not just go for me and my income, but he's also tried to hurt my family and damage the security of our home as well. What a lowlife. Talk about an overblown reaction and a thoroughly nasty thing to do. You just could not sink any lower than that. Everything that I'd planned for, everything that I prepared for, everything I'd geared toward over the last few years was done solely for this moment, and he stole it from me. I had nothing to fall back on, and he mocked me for it, thinking that he was clever and the arch manipulator, knowing that I couldn't fight back with any legal action as I just don't have the funds for it. So all I've been left with is the nuclear option, this video. And if it, or this child, just suddenly disappears one day, then you'll know who to blame. Over the years, Person A weaseled his way into the affections of Andrew's mother through seeming acts of kindness, given that he lived close by while Andrew himself resided over 3 hours away in London. By running errands for her and doing chores around the bungalow, taking her out and keeping her company, he made sure that Jean would become somewhat dependent on him, as he acted like a surrogate son to her. This closeness of proximity certainly gave him the opportunity, but the question always remained: why was he doing this, and what was his true motive? Soon all this would become abundantly clear. Much to Andrew's horror, his mother had named Person A in her will, in that if Andrew and her husband predeceased her, then the estate would be split up between Person A and another individual. It appears that Jean was not the only person with whom he tried this tactic on. Allegedly, during the period in which the now late Andrew Hopkinson's collection was being removed from the bungalow between the summer of 2021 and the Easter of 2022, Person A bragged to a number of witnesses that when a now retired and elderly BBC costume designer passes, then all of their earthly possessions would also become his. This person had worked on Blake 7, Person A's favourite television programme, and still owned many items, including screen use costumes and their original designs. Person A used the same modus operandi as he did on Jean, to worm his way into this individual's affection so that ultimately he'd be named in the will, or at the very least would come into possession of the memorabilia that he so desperately wanted. To facilitate this, he'd treat this person well, invite them to fan events, took them on expensive trips, and even on multiple occasions hosted this retiree at the world-famous London-based celebrity restaurant The Ivy. Although this time around it was all executed on funds taken from the joint Hopkinson estate. He even went as far as to openly brag about their escapades on his Facebook page, and I believe the photographic evidence is still there to this day. Given that Person A had already assumed the estates of 2 deceased people, this, albeit circumstantial evidence, certainly makes it appear as if he were working towards his third. When Andrew found out about Person A's inclusion on his mother's will, he was both aghast and furious, and tried desperately on multiple occasions to have him removed from the document, even after his mother's death in 2019. Unfortunately for him, he failed on each and every attempt. His only option then, to nullify Person A's claim, was to move back into the family home and request funds from his now deceased mother's estate. Andrew was advanced approximately £3,000 so that he could pay for an original screen-used Blake 7 teleport bracelet prop that he'd recently won in an auction. However, after his death in 2021, this left both his and his mother's estate in a form of limbo, where the question of who would now be entitled to the assets arose. Would it all now go to the Crown, or was there another living relative out there who could come forward and lay a claim? Turns out that a will apparently put together by Andrew just a year before his death was conveniently found by Person A's team at Andrew's London flat, a place that he'd not been back to since his mother's death in 2019. That will left almost the entirety of the estate to Person A. This is that will. I have redacted the names, addresses and personal details of all the beneficiaries and the witnesses mentioned for issues concerning privacy and security. It is not my place to dox anyone here. However, the red flags surrounding this will were immediately obvious and instantly raised our suspicions when Dan and I viewed this document for the first time. Firstly, there are just 7 single-sentence instructions given over 2/3 of a page. For an estate such as this, you'd expect there to be more pages. Even his mother's will was 4 pages long. Additionally, it lacks any real detail and makes no mention of Andrew's collection, supplies, tools or resources anywhere. It does, however, mention his personal chattels, but makes no distinction on what this actually covers. It seems to be quite vague, ill thought out and extremely lazy in that regard. Andrew's collection and tools and resources were extremely important to him as they were his lifeblood, so you'd obviously expect him to account for them in his will, yet there is no sign of anything so significant here. It's almost as if they didn't exist. Andrew was also in significant debt and had been so for many years, yet somehow he makes allowances for his partner to receive £5,000, while an arbitrary donation of £500 was to go to charity. Where then would this money have come from if, as claimed by Person A and his team, that there was nothing of value in his estate? I could write an entire dissertation on why the date given, the 9th of January 2020, is so wrong, but as the case is ongoing and still being built, I will not dwell on this issue. Suffice to say, how could Andrew have signed a will in Kent where this was compiled if he had not left the family bungalow some 200 miles away since 2019? Lastly, all the signatures contained within this document looked extremely measured, as if they'd been traced or copied out without much practice. They just didn't flow with the confidence of someone's everyday penmanship. Speaking of signatures, this is Andrew's signature as seen on the will, and this is a known and verified signature, and here is an overlay of the two. The dissimilarity between the two signatures is both stark and worrisome, and along with everything else is precisely what motivated Dan and I to track down Andrew's sole surviving living relative, his cousin, and tell him of our fears. Here's a guide on what to look out for with suspicious wills. You'll notice that many of the prime indicators here seem to apply directly to Andrew Hopkinson's supposed will, the very will that Person A claimed to have conveniently discovered in the London flat and then submitted for approval. And it was these points that heavily pushed the document's validity into some serious doubt. Once on board, Andrew's cousin began to tell us how he had been threatened by both Person A and the cosplay solicitor, in that they continuously kept him at bay, wouldn't tell him what was going on, refused him access to the bungalow, and even how they had the temerity to accuse him of harassing Person A while he was supposedly grieving the death of his very dear friend. Backed up by what we told him, the cousin then employed the services of a real solicitor, who by the 19th of July 2023 had contacted the two will witnesses for a statement. As it turned out, not only did they claim not to know Andrew Hopkinson, but they also claimed never to have met him, not even in passing either, and most damning of all, that they certainly did not sign his will. So then this begs the very obvious question, how then did their signatures come to be on that will? Unfortunately, while it is known how this unfolded, I cannot reveal the answer right now, as it's part of the prosecution evidence for when this case eventually goes to court. But what I can tell you is that both witnesses did indeed sign something, but it was a completely different document. Following on from this massive revelation, the original copy of the will was seized and sent off for forensic testing, and it really wasn't long before things began to move in the favour of Andrew's cousin. On the 4th of September 2023, Dan received this message.
Good morning, Daniel. The news we've been waiting to hear has arrived. Person A's solicitor has emailed Rachel saying the will is definitely a fraud, and Kent police will be investigating other suspects. Don't know what the next steps are, but we'll keep you updated. Thumbs up.
Followed a day or two later by this email from the solicitor who was working on the case, who also said that the value of the items taken had to be assessed.
Dear Daniel, thank you for the further evidence. I do not need hard copies sending. To provide an update, we have now received confirmation from Person A's solicitor that they accept that the will is a forgery and therefore invalid. We therefore won't need to prepare a witness statement for you, but thank you so much for all the evidence and assistance to date.
It turns out that after initially denying everything, Person A sang like a canary and tried to distance himself by blaming everyone else for this whole situation. He even tried to claim that the cosplay solicitor had devised the entire plan and set it into motion for his sole benefit, I might add, without his knowledge or blessing. In a state of total panic and self-preservation, he took no regard in throwing a number of his friends under the bus, just to try and save his own neck. But the problem for him was that no one believed his stories, not even his own solicitor, a real one by the way, not the cosplay one, and ultimately he had no choice. He had to admit what they'd all done. With Andrew's cousin now wanting to involve the police, he requested information on what was taken from the bungalow, and so Dan and I set about accounting for everything that was removed, including the items that were illegally sold on. Thankfully, everyone who received items would often speak about it on social media, so it was really easy to trace who had what. We were tasked with making an evaluation of the collection's worth based on similar sales through specialist auction houses, eBay and the likes, and the result was somewhat of an eye-opener. Even taking into account that what we gave was a deliberately conservative value to each item, the amount that it all came to was still an eye-watering £120,000. This did not even take into account the items that simply disappeared without a trace, such as the missing batch of vintage model kits that were worth several £1,000s, the highly sought-after autographs, the scripts, or even the rare books on a variety of subject matters. When you add that to the value of the bungalow with all its land and planning permission, the estate's standing came to a total of £1.2 million. That is fraud on a truly industrial and epic scale. As 2023 came to a close, Personet was starting to feel the heat and the repercussions of his failed dodgy plan. Rumours were already circulating about what he'd done, something that he consistently moaned about, trying to carry favour and sympathy from the few friends that he had left. He cried that it was all lies set out to deliberately ruin him and that he was completely innocent of all the claims laid against him. Oh God, the irony on that score. He was openly mocked and called a thief at the 2023 Small Space event in Milton Keynes, and he was dropped from his appearance on the BBC's flagship television programme, The Antiques Roadshow. An appearance that at the time of recording he was rather proud of, because he got to show off his ill-gotten gains to an international audience, which would feed beautifully into his massively inflated ego. Several convention organisers declined to have him at their events, and by the Christmas of that year, he was forced to start selling off his prized possessions to pay back the money he stole from Andrew Hopkinson's side of the estate. Ironically, a number of the items that he sold here were actually the pieces that he took from Andrew's inventory during the Bungalow clearance of 2021 to 2022. I mean, what a bloody idiot, selling off the property that he stole to pay back the money that he'd illicitly taken from that very same estate. As a consequence, he'd now embroiled further innocent people into his harebrained scheme. He really did rob Peter to pay Paul. To say that justice was served would be an entirely and vastly inaccurate statement. Yes, he and his cronies were caught out in their below-par Machiavellian conspiracy, and yes, he began attempting to repay the money that he used to fund his lavish lifestyle. But there is still the matter of all the stolen property that he took, the props, the models, the kits, and the rare books, plus a vast quantity of rare autographs and all manner of other items that he spirited away. It's still all out there somewhere, residing in the collections of buyers who are probably completely unaware that what they bought was stolen property. Unfortunately for them, at some point in the future, there will come a time when they will receive a knock on the door as part of the recovery process. Moving into 2024, Person A's health began to decline, probably due to the stress caused by the unravelling of his massive fraud, and ultimately, at the end of May, he would be admitted into hospital for a medical procedure. Alas, things did not go well for him, and he died in the early hours of Saturday, June the 1st. How this will affect the case is anyone's guess. He may no longer be here, but those involved and who are directly connected to this crime still are. On a final note, when my ex-friend came to see me for the last time on July the 4th, some 5 weeks after Person A's death, he curtly told me that he'd recently buried his good chum in a manner that very much felt like he was blaming me for his death. I mean, come on. It's not like I caused him to fake a will and then get found out, and neither was I his surgeon, so my conscience is totally clear. But what I do find rather fitting is that shortly before the Wish version of Moriarty left my property, and just after he'd regaled me with his concerted plans to ruin me and force me to shut down my business and all my social media pages, he told me this. If you think that after all this, I'm just going to sail away into the distance, never to be heard from again, then think twice. You've got another thing coming. You'll be hearing from my solicitor. Of course, I never did actually hear from him again. There was no solicitor's letter, nothing, not even a peep. It was all just a load of hot air and misplaced bravado. To be brutally honest, a mouse is more threatening than he is. In fact, it's a bit like being challenged to fisticuffs with the Go Compare Man. It's just that laughable in how ridiculous all this is. What he did do, however, was to very bravely block me and my family on WhatsApp and Facebook, like the true coward that he is. Not that this really mattered to us in the slightest, as we weren't even friends with him on Facebook anyway, and I barely spoke to him on WhatsApp as it was. Oh, and the less said about his oh-so-top-secret filming with the BBC that he so desperately tried to hint to me about without actually revealing any details, the better. The thing is, I already knew about it, as the proper model-making community is rather small and people do talk. The BBC had borrowed a few of his studio-scale models to film some new effect sequences for an up-and-coming Blu-ray release of some remastered Blake 7 episodes. But because he's just so great, he absolutely had to brag about this fact to his Twitter audience of precisely 0 followers, and that he was also proud to announce that he would be gracing the attendees with his presence during the official BBC screening of these episodes at the British Film Institute. Shiver my timbers, how gloriously wonderful of him to deign to mix with the plebs, so gracious. You know, I'm genuinely surprised that he didn't set up a booth of some kind so that his subjects could bask in his glory and receive his autograph if they were lucky, because he is such a top bloke after all, and now a true A-list celebrity. Apparently, according to someone working on this endeavour, some heavy CGI was needed to tidy those models up. I do wonder, though, if he used any of the soul models that he received from Andrew's collection and all of this, because I'm fairly sure the BBC would be over the moon with him if he did. Look, it's none of my business, and I really don't care anyway. Interestingly, not too long after his departure from my house, someone who I don't even know and have no affiliation with contacted me out of the blue about my ex-friend to extol what a thoroughly unlikable narcissist that he really is. Not only that, but he went on to reveal how my ex-chum and his friends have completely ruined every fan event out there by getting involved in ingratiating themselves with the organisers and the special guests, then making themselves the centre of attention rather than the memorabilia that they're supposed to be displaying. The same goes for any fan-led project or forum, in that they always just waltz in, take over and spoil it for everyone else. From what I'm hearing, it seems like this group of sycophants have turned from mere fans into somewhat of an elevated cult in their own right. Or at least I think that's what's been said, but I could have misheard. If you know where to look, there's even a wonderfully amusing video that talks about what a massive dickhead he is, along with his fellow window-licking hangers-on. So where does that leave us now? Well, personally, I'll simply have to move on and try to rebuild my life and recover from the financial strain that all this has put me and my family under. But I'll do so safe in the knowledge that the sleazy, clout-chasing little empire that these braggarts tried to create has started to crumble. People are finally beginning to see them for who they really are, scheming shysters who will stop at nothing to claw their way to the top of the pile, a pile that's not even really worth climbing in the first place. I mean, it's just a bunch of dusty old TV programmes that have seriously had their day and whose stars are rapidly starting to fade into obscurity. As to the fraud, well, that's all out in the open now and is being dealt with by the solicitors. But I have been informed that the probate for the Hopkinson estate is about to be awarded to the rightful heir, Andrew's cousin, and it does look like he aims to press charges and ultimately retrieve all that stolen property. So, for those involved, I'd seriously suggest that they start looking over their shoulders for those flashing blue lights. It really has been a long time coming, but the clock is now ticking and 0 hour is almost here. Additionally, the rightful heir wishes for the world to know exactly what really happened over the course of the last 3 years, rather than for anyone to remain fooled by the web of deceit and lies that they may have already heard. This was a crime born out of sheer greed by several people who didn't care who they harmed or crawled all over in the pursuit of their deeds, even if that meant throwing their own friends under the bus. At the end of the day, all they were interested in was getting their greasy little hands on bits of tat that they didn't have any legal right to, tat that they valued above all else. It really is quite sad, really. It's imperative for you to know that their misguided and criminal actions adversely affected every one of the victims who were drawn into this. It caused a lot of trouble, stress and heartache, and so with the blessing of Andrew's cousin, these revelations are exactly what this video is all about. And now you know. Right, my friends, I'm very well aware that this video has been quite a deep dive, and I thank you all for your patience in sticking with it this far, but we all felt that it was high time that this information came to light. Now, obviously I've not told you everything, as I'd probably need a couple of days of your time for that, but you know enough to be getting along with. Before you go, I'll leave you with some video footage that my friend Dan shot at the bungalow in question. It'll just serve as a little illustration as to what all this was about. In the meantime, if you could leave a like, share this video, and perhaps even make a comment down below, that would be excellent. I'm a tiny channel and all these kind of interactions really do help me out. There's even a super thanks option here if you'd care to leave a tip, but that's entirely your call. Don't feel pressured to do so, but it would be awesome if you did, as it all helps keep the lights on here. So for now then, take care, thanks ever so much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now then.
So there's his bungalow, and let's take a little bit of a walk down here. And this, you can sort of see this kind of like Andy's like his mum had this driveway done a little while back, but all this is all overgrown. If you can see in here, there used to be, this is where he used to make his props and models in here. But you can't really see it that well now, but so basically Gary repainted all of this, stripped everything out. You see those are little bits that he, perspex that he actually milled on a lathe. So he cleaned all this out, but the real value is
There's a shed there.
they used, where this is here, where these are grown up, there was 2 sheds there. We don't know why, but somebody overshot the junction. Some old guy had like a bit of a turn and he ploughed straight into one of them and demolished it.
Is that on at the back? That was property.
See where that hedge is down there? That's the whole garden.
So that is part of the property.
Yeah, all of this. This side is where Jeff lives. That's the cousin. So they're the ones who they try to fleece out of the estate. Yeah, but this all used to be kept immaculate. Yeah, but there's actually 2 sheds down there which you can't see, and also down there in there there'll be a big fiberglass dome which is from Blake 7, which was just left there, unless Gary burnt it. I don't know. But yeah, so basically what they got told was if they could get planning permission on this plot of land, they were looking at between £800,000 and £900,000 worth of value.
Oh yeah, easy.
Yeah, and that's what he was hoping to get. That's why he was that's why he faked the will. But yeah.
Some sad sycophants.
Hey?
Some sad sycophants.
Yeah. Well, like I said, we used to have the bonfires down, well, just here they were. So this bit here, obviously this is where the drive went to, but yeah, there used to be two really big sheds just here. But yeah, you can sort of see all that land. So all to that boundary there, where the washing line is, all of that is what Gary was trying to fleece from Jeff, basically. So yeah, just Lawrence just. And there you have it.